Welcome to the Ars Amandi workshop demo video. I'm Sarah Bowman and this is my husband,
Harrison Greene.
And we were hoping to have Lizzie Stark and Emily Boss for this video. We tried to get it recorded last week at a con, but we just couldn't get the schedule synced up, so we're going to do this together at our home instead. So the idea behind Ars Amandi is to provide a safe way for people to experience love and sexuality and intimacy in a LARP space. Oftentimes there are mechanics such as back rubs or holding pinkies or narrating what's happening. This is a technique that was developed by Emma Wieslander from the Nordic countries. And the idea is to simulate what it's like to touch and feel close and intimate by only using the hands, the arms, and in some cases the shoulder. Although for this workshop we're not going to integrate the shoulder, we're just going to have the arms and the hands. So the purpose of this mechanic is to give people an option if they would like to explore romantic feelings in games. Oftentimes we have mechanics for violence and very, very elaborate ones, but we don't always have ways to simulate touching and closeness. So this is a technique that is optional, and it's for people who would like to engage in this sort of play. Obviously, it's not for everyone, and the goal here is to show one form of workshop that we've been running here in Texas and also in New Jersey that is a little bit different than maybe others you've read online, but hopefully will allow you to run your own workshops and get started with this technique yourself if you're interested. There are other resources available. Emma Wieslander has a Ars Amandi webpage, which I highly suggest looking at. Her techniques are a little bit different. For example, in a lot of the workshops, the organizer will have people stand up. I prefer for people to be able to sit down, especially if they have chronic pain or other kinds of issues. So there are going to be some slight differences, and I highly suggest reading all the links that I'm going to put on this video so that you can learn more. But we're just going to show you what we've been running here in Texas. So the way to start the workshop is just to get everybody feeling comfortable being intimate. And one of the ways that I do that is by asking them a series of questions. First I'll have them introduce themselves, then I'll have them say something that they feel makes them special, and then I'll have them do something that makes them feel safe, and then I'll have them share something that makes them feel unsafe. So let's go ahead and start with Harrison.
Hi, I'm Harrison. What makes me feel special? I like to think that I'm very creative, and that makes me feel pretty special. What makes me feel safe? Physical closeness and reassuring words make me feel pretty safe. And what was the last one? Unsafe?
What makes you feel unsafe?
What makes me feel unsafe? People talking about me right out of my earshot, but doing it in a way that I can still perceive that I'm being talked about, makes me feel very unsafe.
So this isn't going to be a laundry list of everything that could possibly make us feel safe or unsafe, but it's a way for us to, first of all, validate each other's feelings, and second of all, get used to sharing things that we might normally feel are uncomfortable, since this workshop is pretty intense, and it does include quite a bit of intimacy.
You might find a lot of the people that you're with have very similar things that make them feel safe and unsafe.
The next thing to do is to ask about boundaries and triggers. Some people have certain parts of their hands or arms that are upsetting. Others may have content that they aren't comfortable exploring. There is a slight role play aspect to this workshop. So having things such as letting people know if pregnancy is a trigger, for example, because there will be a scene about that. Letting people say ahead of time what issues they might have to make it more safe for everyone. We had one individual who had harmed her arm, so she explained which areas of her arm were safe to touch, that sort of thing. Another thing you can do is have people be very aware of their hands. Right now I'm wearing my wedding ring. I might choose to take it off, not as a symbol, but rather just to give a space for people to touch. Or you might choose to leave it on, and that gives them something interesting to explore with their hands. Obviously you also want them to wash their hands beforehand, just, hygiene is good. So we established the group consensus about what is comfortable. So if one person just really isn't comfortable with the upper arms, we haven't had that problem so far, but let's just say that's the case. The idea behind Ars Amandi is to avoid the bathing suit areas. So let's say somebody's uncomfortable with this area. If the group consensus is that, then we kind of, go a little lower. But generally up to the arms tends to be okay. And then there's another way to establish safety, and that's through tapping out. So if we're in a scene and I do something that Harrison maybe is a little bit uncomfortable with, maybe I'm going too far, or maybe I'm scratching, or he can do a double tap, and that is the equivalent of a brake, meaning put on the brakes, slow down, maybe back off a little bit, and then I can be a little bit more gentle. And if he just feels very uncomfortable and doesn't want to be in the scene anymore, he can do 4 taps, and that indicates that we cut immediately, and he can leave the circle without any repercussions. We call this the open door policy. What that means is that the door is always open. This allows people to feel safe when they engage in any kind of role-playing activity. But the idea is for it to be sort of a revolving door. So if you do have to leave a group, let's say you get triggered, or the workshop brings up some sort of discomfort for you, make sure to just at least check back with the person running the workshop, and perhaps with the other participants later, just to kind of be kind and let them know. You don't have to necessarily tell them why, but just say that you appreciate it, and that you are sorry, because that's a kind thing to do. Generally, though, we haven't really had to worry about anybody tapping out. People have actually really enjoyed it. And I think a lot of that has to do with the music. Music selection is very, very important. Finding music that's very soothing and very sort of intimate in the lyrics and in the sounds, perhaps sensual, is important. So I'll give you a list of suggested songs that I like, but there's plenty of them out there. Something that just gets people in the mood and makes them feel like they can sort of share. Another great aspect is that we rotate in the circles, which I'll explain in a second, every 2 to 3 minutes. So what that does is, if a scene is getting very intense between, say, Harrison and I, he knows that at any minute now I'll be asked to move, or he will. And what that does is it allows people to sort of let that energy disperse, and they'll be on to the next experience. So as I mentioned before, I prefer to do the workshop sitting down. We've done it in chairs, and we've done it on the floor. But the idea is to have a center ring and then an external ring. So the center ring are people with their backs to one another, and the external ring are the people that are going to rotate. And in order to make sure that everybody gets a chance to interact with everyone, at a certain point during the workshop, depending on how many number of people you have, you're going to have to sort of move people around to make sure that everybody gets to interact. So be very sensitive to the placement of the people in the circles, and make sure everybody gets to touch each other. And you can even ask halfway through, hey, who hasn't been able to interact with who? So again, I tend to do the workshop for about an hour and a half, depending on how much time we have. And the first half of the workshop is going to be just exploring the hands. So you start with eyes closed and touching. Right now Harrison is passive while I am active. So it doesn't mean that he can't do anything, but it just means that he's just sort of allowing me to take the lead. And then the next round we're going to switch partners, and also switch from passive to active. And so now he's the active party. And as we move through each rotation, we're going to add more elements of the arm. So we're going to reach up to the forearm, and then eventually we're going to reach up to the shoulder. We're going to start integrating breath. And we're going to start integrating eye contact. If you're anything like me, eye contact is very intimidating. It doesn't mean that you have to stare at someone, which can be similar to eye gazing, if any of you have ever heard of that practice, which can be very, very intense. Just keep in mind that a little bit with the eyes can be a flirtation, it can be a challenge. There's a lot that you can communicate with the eyes. And so I like to integrate in the first round eye contact towards the end, and then again in the second round, as I'll explain in a second, eye contact towards the end. So this allows people to kind of build up to a more intensity as they go along. So the first round is exploring the arms, and the second round is going to be adding a role play element. And in that second round is generally when I'll switch people up so they get a chance to interact with multiple people. The role-playing element is sort of vague. We don't really establish characters per se, but we establish situations. So there are several situations that basically mimic the life cycle of a relationship. This is a technique from one of the Nordic larps that Lizzie Stark had heard about when she started doing these workshops in the US. And so I've expanded it just a little bit to have more of a range of different kinds of experiences. So you kind of are going from the first date to perhaps the first sexual encounter, to maybe a proposal, feelings of doubt, maybe you're on a honeymoon, then there's illness, betrayal, pregnancy, a retirement celebration with a sort of change in lifestyle, a final vacation, and this one I like to have them climb up a mountain together as sort of a symbol of their life together and their trials. And once they reach the top of the mountain, they see a sunset, and they hold hands and they contemplate their life together. And I just recently integrated an extra stage, which is the moment of death. And this is totally optional, obviously. It makes for a very, very intense scene. But in these scenes, you're not verbally describing anything to each other. You're simply communicating through touch. Let's say if we're doing the death scene, which one of us is the one letting go? And maybe I do that by having less strength in my hand. And he responds in the way that he responds. It doesn't have to be a sad scene, it can be a beautiful scene. It really depends on how the participants decide to take it, and it depends on how you as a facilitator decide to frame it. Don't speak too much while they're in the process, but give them enough direction. I found that, for example, the betrayal scene, if I just say betrayal, they often have a hard time figuring out what to do with that. So maybe giving them, one of them has betrayed the other by sleeping with someone else behind their back, or something to that degree. So giving them enough of a story to work with that it gives them an emotion. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to start with, for the second round, just hands and arms, and exploring all these different range of emotions and experiences. And then work towards the breathing and the eyes open towards the end. So by the time you get to that last scene, your eyes are open and you're gazing at each other. You don't have to stare, you can look away at times, but that adds more intensity to the experience. Now, depending on the comfort level of your group, you can make this more erotic, depending. Since we often work with new LARPers, or people who are not used to role-playing this kind of content, or people at conventions, we tend to downplay the sexual aspect of it. What we found is that you can communicate a lot through Ars Amandi other than just erotic scenes. So do you want to tell an example of how you used it in Dystopia Rising?
Sure. So in one particular scene, myself and another character were dealing with a very tragic loss, and we started expressing those emotions through Ars Amandi. mostly through very tightly gripping each other's hands, moving up the arms, and just sort of reassuring each other with constant touch and constant pressure to sort of, I guess, represent that sort of clinging, we need to hold on to each other sort of feelings. To not go too deeply, but for the more sexual sort of scenes, the breath and rapidity of certain motions becomes highly symbolic of certain actions. I'll leave you to figure that out on your own.
But if you're in a workshop and you want to experiment with those sorts of things, which we don't do a lot of in the workshops we run, but could easily, depending on the comfort level of your group, be integrated. You can work with the ways that your hands are positioned and that sort of thing to try to make things more representational rather than sort of generic touch. All right.
I'd also probably say if you're wanting your workshop to go that way, you probably want to, you definitely want to get everyone's consent and buy-in before you amp it up to a sexual sort of experience.
So one thing that I think is really important is whenever you finish a round, so whenever somebody says, whenever the facilitator says rotate, you have them thank their partner. It's extremely scary. Sex is very scary. Intimacy is very scary. And it's scary to be in a workshop, particularly with people you don't know. There's, performance anxiety. There's all sorts of fears that happen. So sometimes it's really nice to, when you're asked to rotate, to just look at each other and say thank you, thank you, thank you. And then you move to the next person. So that sort of adds, it's similar to in yoga, a sort of namaste. It's like, I acknowledge you, thank you for what you've shared with me. So as you are reaching the last of the narrative elements of the workshop, then you will go ahead and have them thank their partner for the final time.
Thank you.
And you will have everybody get into a debriefing circle where everybody can see each other. And this is similar to the circle in the beginning when you asked everybody to share about their fears and their things that make them feel safe. This is a way for us to all feel connected. However, the doors always open policy also is very important for debriefs. Some people don't feel comfortable debriefing. Sometimes they have emotions that come up that they need to process on their own. So while the debrief is technically part of the workshop, you should emphasize to them if for whatever reason they need to opt out of the workshop debrief, they can. However, it is encouraged if they are feeling up to it to stay and to share with the participants their experiences because that allows everybody to feel that they've maybe exposed something and that thing has remained safe. So that sort of brings us back to that discourse. So the debriefing doesn't have to go on super long. Some people do like to share their feelings, however. Certain scenes get very exciting or very interesting and they want to explore those dynamics. But the debriefing is very, very short. At first to ask if somebody has anything they absolutely want to share right away, and then they can do that. Then just have everybody in the room in order answer the question, what was the most profound moment of the experience? And since we just integrated the death scenario, that oftentimes is the first thing that comes to mind. So I encourage you to also think about sort of guiding them to earlier scenes that might have been very significant as well. So, oftentimes the darker scenes, the betrayal and whatnot, those things can be very intense. When you're organizing people in the rounds, try to make sure that you don't have the same people experiencing negative emotions as couples together, because that can happen. So every time they see them, they're like, oh geez, now we're dealing with illness. So generally it'll take 1 or 2 rounds of sharing those kinds of experiences that stand out. And then you'll want to ask them if this is something that they could see integrating into their LARP group, and if so, how. And then I like to end debriefs on a happy note. So I like to ask everyone what their favorite moment was or their most exciting or happiest moment was, so that they sort of leave on a positive. During debriefing sessions, it's often best to try to distance a little bit. So instead, we don't really have characters in this workshop, but you can say, you know, when my character and your character were going through the illness, it was very comforting when your character held my arm, as opposed to you. So this allows a little bit of distance in order to sort of separate, de-roll, as we call it, during the debrief. But other than that, it's pretty simple. The reason to have a workshop is so that people aren't just going in blind, that they've sort of piloted the experience. And if somebody has been through the workshop and later decides to engage in an Ars Amandi scene with someone in character that is not, I really think that it's fine to break character briefly, however your mechanic is for that, and to sort of, first of all, establish consent, obviously, but also to just sort of give a brief rundown of how it works, and sort of guide them through the process. It's a slight break of immersion, but it's much easier and better to make sure that the other person feels safe and is consenting.
You're basically introducing a new mechanic, if you need to look at it that way.
We've had people who haven't known the mechanic and have stood awkwardly trying to figure out how to proceed. And that scene might not have happened that way if they had a tool at their disposal. Is there anything else you want to add?
That seems pretty conclusive to me.
All right, thank you.